The hospital room was too bright, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Clara blinked, her head throbbing as she tried to piece together where she was. The last thing she remembered was the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, and then, nothing. Her body felt heavy, her limbs like lead, but she forced herself to sit up, wincing at the sharp pain in her side. "Clara?" A voice cut through the haze, deep and familiar, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She turned her head slowly, her vision swimming for a moment before focusing on the man standing by the door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to bore into her. Mark. Her husband. The name came to her like a distant echo, but the way he looked at her, intense, possessive, made her stomach twist. "You're awake," he said, stepping closer. His voice was soft, almost tender, but there was something beneath it that made her skin crawl. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "I was so worried about you." Clara forced a weak smile, her mind racing. She didn't remember much, but she remembered enough. The fights. The way his hands would grip her arms too tightly. The way he'd look at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She couldn't let him know she remembered. Not yet. Where am I?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She hated how small she sounded, but it was the only way to play this. Mark's expression softened, and he sat on the edge of the bed, his hand still resting on her face. "You're in the hospital, sweetheart. You were in an accident. Do you remember anything?" She shook her head slowly, feigning confusion. "No. I don't remember anything." His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, and she held her breath, waiting for him to call her bluff. But then he smiled, leaning in to press a kiss to her forehead. "It's okay. You'll remember soon enough. The doctor said it's just temporary." Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, studying her every move. She had to be careful. One wrong step, and he'd see right through her. "You should rest," he said, his hand sliding down to squeeze her shoulder. "I'll be right here if you need anything." She forced another smile, lying back against the pillows as he stood up. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. She couldn't stay here with him. Not now that she knew what he was capable of. But she had to be smart about it. She couldn't just run. He'd find her. As she closed her eyes, pretending to sleep, she heard him move around the room, his footsteps soft but deliberate. She could feel his presence like a shadow looming over her, and she fought the urge to shiver. She had to get out of here. But how? The next few days passed in a blur of tests and questions from the doctors. Clara played the part of the confused amnesiac perfectly, answering their questions with wide-eyed innocence and feigned frustration when she couldn't remember something. Mark was always there, hovering in the background, watching her like a hawk. She could feel his eyes on her every time she spoke, every time she moved. It was suffocating. But then, on the third day, something changed. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the parking lot below, when Mark walked in with a bouquet of flowers. He set them on the table beside her bed, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice warm but with that undercurrent of control that made her skin crawl. "Better," she said softly, forcing a smile. "Still can't remember much, though." He nodded, sitting down beside her and taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, almost too tight, but she didn't pull away. "It'll come back," he said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "And until it does, I'll take care of you." Clara's stomach churned, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you," she whispered. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "You know I'd do anything for you, Clara." "Anything." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, and she knew what was coming next. His lips brushed against her neck, sending a shiver down her spine, not from pleasure, but from fear. Mark, she started, but he cut her off with a kiss, his mouth pressing against hers with a possessiveness that made her want to scream. She froze for a moment before forcing herself to respond, her lips moving against his as she tried to keep up the act. His hand slid up her arms, gripping her shoulders as he deepened the kiss, his tongue pushing past her lips. She could feel the heat of his body pressing against hers, and she hated how familiar it felt. How many times had they done this before? How many times had she let him take what he wanted because she was too afraid to say no? But not this time. She pulled away gently, breaking the kiss and forcing a shy smile onto her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking down at her hands. I don't remember us like that yet." Mark's eyes darkened for a moment, but then he smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's okay," he said softly. "We'll take it slow." Clara nodded, relief flooding through her as he leaned back in his chair. But she could still feel the weight of his gaze on her, and she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, as she lay in bed pretending to sleep, she heard him leave the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. She waited a few minutes before slipping out of bed, her heart pounding as she grabbed the bag of clothes one of the nurses had brought her earlier. She had to move fast. She crept to the door, peeking out into the hallway to make sure he wasn't there before stepping out. The hospital was quiet at this hour, the only sound the faint hum of the vending machines down the hall. She moved quickly but quietly, her bare feet silent against the linoleum floor. She was almost to the elevator when she heard his voice behind her. "Clara?" She froze, her blood running cold as she turned to see him standing there, his arms crossed over his chest and a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Where do you think you're going?" She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, the sound of his voice slicing through the sterile hospital air like a blade. Mark stood there, his broad frame blocking the hallway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. But it was his eyes that held her captive, those piercing blue eyes that always seemed to see too much, to know too much. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She couldn't let him see the fear that coiled in her stomach, the way her hands trembled at her sides. She had to play this carefully, like a game of chess where one wrong move could mean checkmate. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked again, his voice low and steady, but with an edge that made her skin prickle. She took a step toward him, her movements deliberate, her chin lifted just enough to show she wasn't cowering. "I needed some air," she said, her voice calm, though her pulse raced. The room was starting to feel suffocating. Mark's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she thought he might call her bluff. But then he uncrossed his arms and took a step closer, closing the distance between them. His presence was overwhelming, the heat of his body radiating toward her, the faint scent of his cologne filling her senses. "You should have told me," he said, his tone softer now, almost gentle. "I would have gone with you." Clara forced a small smile, her mind racing. She had to keep him off balance, had to make him believe she was still the woman he thought she was, the woman who needed him, who depended on him. She reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. "I didn't want to bother you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been so attentive since the accident. I didn't want to be a burden." Mark's hand came up to cover hers, his fingers warm and firm as they pressed against her skin. "You're never a burden, Clara," he said, his voice thick with something she couldn't quite place. "You're my wife. It's my job to take care of you." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of suspicion, any hint that he didn't believe her act. But all she saw was that same intensity, that same possessiveness that had always been there. And then, something else, a flicker of vulnerability, a crack in the armor he wore so well. It was that crack she needed to exploit. She leaned in closer, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, "I remember everything, Mark. And I want you to show me what you can do to make me remember it all again." For a moment, he froze, his body tensing beneath her touch. She could feel the shift in him, the way his breath caught, the way his grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. And then he pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers with a mix of surprise and something darker, something more dangerous. "You remember?" he asked, his voice rough, almost disbelieving. Clara nodded, her gaze steady as she met his. "Everything," she repeated, her voice soft but firm. "The accident, us, all of it." Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might pull away, might retreat into the cold, controlled version of himself that she knew so well. But instead, he stepped closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin. "Good," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. "Because I've missed you, Clara. More than you can imagine." Her breath caught in her throat at the raw emotion in his voice, at the way his eyes burned into hers. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to be so open. It threw her off balance, made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. But she couldn't let him see that. She had to stay in control. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a small, teasing smile. "Then show me," she said softly, her voice laced with just enough challenge to make his eyes darken. "Show me what I've been missing." For a long moment, he just stared at her, his gaze intense, almost predatory. And then, without a word, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both tender and possessive, a kiss that sent a shiver down her spine despite herself. When he pulled back, his eyes were blazing with something she couldn't quite name. "Not here," he said, his voice rough with desire. "Let's go home." Clara hesitated for just a moment, her mind racing with the implications of what she was about to do. But then she nodded, her hand slipping into his as she let him lead her toward the elevator. As they stepped inside and the doors closed behind them, she could feel the tension between them thickening, the air charged with an electricity that made her skin tingle. Mark's hand tightened around hers, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm as he leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this," he murmured, his voice low and husky. "To have you back, to have you remember." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face him, her eyes locking with his. "Then don't make me wait any longer," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. Mark's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Oh, Clara," he said softly, his voice dripping with promise. "You won't have to." The elevator dinged as it reached the ground floor, the doors sliding open to reveal the bustling hospital lobby beyond. But Clara barely noticed. All she could focus on was the man beside her, the way his hand felt in hers, the way his eyes burned into hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. As they stepped out into the lobby and headed toward the exit, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. But she also knew that she couldn't turn back now. She had started this game, and she would see it through to the end. No matter what it cost her.